Chapter 16 Gaust Redmond. "A flock of crows is called a murder," Katlyn said as another crow joined the dozen or so gathering around Quentin's body, Red's fighters having already picked him clean of coins, weapons, even buttons and bangles. "Is that right?" Cody said, his eyes following one crow in particular that broke from the rest of the murder to alight on Red's shoulder. She tossed a seed of some sort up to its mouth that it caught in midair with its beak. The crow remained perched on her shoulder as she gathered the fighters and the freed children into a loose group headed for the forest. She paid little attention to Haille and the others, and Haille felt their opportunity slipping away. "We've got to travel with them. We'll be safer. You saw what she did to those slavers," Haille said. "Aye, I did." Val was stone-faced. "She's a legend. You must have heard of her before." "Can't say that I have," Val said. "The heralds in the city are often spreading news of her raids and her exploits," Katlyn said. "That is interesting, because she does not seem to leave many witnesses," Val said. "True observation, Captain. Makes one speculate how those heralds heard about her in the first place." Cody nodded. "Are we going to follow them or not?" Haille asked. Val studied the bodies, the burning wagon, and finally the ragged-looking children herded together and making their way towards freedom. His expression softened. "Always safer in a crowd, I suppose. Anyway, I'd hate to see any harm come to those children." "Great," Haille said, now running to catch up with Red. "So we follow." Red took them on a course deep into the forest. There was no hope of concealing their tracks, so instead, Red pushed for speed. It was not easy for the children who were weary, homesick, and underfed. Nor was the path easy for the horses, since it snaked along slippery riverbanks, climbed over outcroppings, and threaded narrow gorges. Cody and Val brought up the rear, but not without curses, falling behind only to catch up when Red allowed the children to break and rest. The elk negotiated the path with relative comfort. Less than an hour into their travel, the smallest and weakest children had found their way onto its back. The others seemed to forget their cares, their aching feet, and their grumbling stomachs when it was near them, their pain replaced by wonder. On breaks they would scramble to be the first to lay against its sides, soft and welcoming with fur as they were. It brought to mind, for Haille, a mother wolf, her ferocity tamed for the sake of her squirming, mewling pups. Rain drummed down upon them during the first night. Red and her fighters pushed them all in order to reach a network of caves hidden within a dell where they were sheltered from the weather and safe from attack. Val and Cody helped to build a roaring fire in a ring of stones that Red and her fighters had used before. Sheltered from the weather and hidden from sight by cliffs and evergreens, their boughs thick with beards of moss, even Red's fighters relaxed, collapsing amid their grass cloaks and bows and arrows to fall into deep slumber. This was a shelter Red and her companions used often, for it was stocked with barrels of supplies, including fresh water and hardtack biscuits. The children made a porridge with the biscuits and water. It was tasteless, but it was the first real meal they had eaten in days. Many of the younger children went to sleep soon after. Some of the older ones sat around the fire in silence, poking at its coals with sticks aimlessly until Cody settled down beside them and started to tell stories. Haille was not sure how much of the story was true and how much was invention, but it was entertaining. Haille heard again the tale of Val tricking the Anthorian soldiers into raiding their own supply line. Val pretended to be asleep, but Haille could tell he was listening by the smile formed at the corners of his mouth. Katlyn was asleep with the rest of the smallest children, all nestled against the elk, who was wide awake and alert, its luminous eyes reflecting the fire, its ears twitching to the slightest sounds from outside. Haille noticed Red sitting alone near the cave mouth, her eyes focused on raindrops tinkling in a puddle just beyond the shelter of the cave. Her hands held a whetstone, but she had long stopped sharpening the blade. Haille sensed an opportunity, sat down opposite, and studied her. Her body was small and compact, but sinewy like a tumbler or dancer. Her shoulders were square, not unlike a young man's. Her hair was so blonde it was nearly white, and it was so thin that her scalp was visible through her part that ran like a scar across her skull. Her hands were diminutive, and she wore fingerless gloves that wrapped about her wrists for support, as Haille had seen many bowmen do. Most everything on her appeared worn and weathered as if she had spent many a night over many months and years exposure to the elements. Her cracked and worn baldric, made of a reddish leather, was slung tightly against her body, its upper strap resting between her breasts. The shoulders of her tunic were faded and fraying, the knees of her breeches patched. Although her face was youngish, even elfin in its appearance, Haille noticed again how her eyes were rayed by more wrinkles than he would expect. She broke her gaze off from the raindrops outside the cave mouth and began sliding her whetstone along her knife with a shick, shick sound. She offered no greeting, and Haille sucked at his teeth, trying to think of something to say. "How did you know Quentin would come out of the wagon when you set fire to it?" She ran the stone across her knife a few more times before answering. "Quentin was a selfish coward. I knew he would want to plead for his life." Haille nodded. "You must have known many men of his like. Slavers, I mean." "Aye." Haille found himself sucking at his teeth again. The quiet that followed was broken only by the shick, shick of the whetstone. "Well, I'm grateful for your protection," he said, getting up. "I guess I should get some sleep." "You'll need it." The next day was relentless. Clouds remained low in the sky, and a fine drizzle fell on them throughout the morning. That, combined with the rain from the night before, made for slow going through mud, high streams, and grass that was heavy with moisture. By mid-morning they were a silent, somber, and soaking procession, the joy of freedom long worn off, and the children asking when they would be allowed to seek their way home. "These parts are not safe," Red told them. "First we will go to my father's manor. There you will have time to recover from your ordeal, and we will begin the work of returning you to your home." The rains came again in the afternoon. By now, even Val and Cody had dismounted and let the weakest children ride in their saddles. The elk's back was full, so Katlyn walked alongside Haille, who had fallen back from his position at the front where he had followed Red closely the first day. "Not a girl of many words, is she?" Katlyn said. "No," Haille said, trying to hide his disappointment. "But how many true heroes are boastful? But many are merciful. You still think she should not have killed Quentin?" Katlyn shrugged. "Who am I to judge? Let us hope we don't ever end up on the wrong side of her blade." In the late afternoon they passed a structure made of branches and rotting thatch. It was really no more than a lean-to, constructed to shelter field workers from the rain. But at the sight of it, Red's fighters gave a cheer. "We are at the border of my father's lands," Red said. "We will reach the manor by nightfall." Their pace picked up after that. Soon they passed along rock walls separating plowed and fallow fields. Although they were safely on Red's family lands, they were still a great distance from any permanent settlement. The holdings were endless, and it took the rest of the evening to cross them. Closer in, the land seemed to be less farm and more fortress. They passed through rings of pickets constructed of sharpened tree branches, earthen walls, and planted brambles. Men with weathered and scarred faces stood guard there and saluted Red as she passed. The light of day had given way to darkness when the flickering windows of the manor house finally came into view. 3 stories of stone and timber were visible across the field of rye that surrounded it. Moonlight shone on the slate roof that was still dark from the day's rains. Shadows danced across its face as figures passed among fires and torches lit around its own curtain wall. Haille's attention fell to the warm lights flickering from within the windows and the promise of rest. Like many great manors, a small town of buildings surrounded the main house. Although finally free, Haille was surprised they did not stop right away at the smithy. The children, their chains broken, still were burdened with manacles, as were Val and Cody from their imprisonment at the manor in Kinth. But by the look of the smithy and the men around it, Haille thought it was best that they waited until morning. The men were scarred, hardened, and cruel-looking, and although they greeted Red with respect, Haille did not like the way they looked upon the children and himself, with faces empty of pity. Not what he expected of men used to breaking bonds. The whole property had less the feel of a family farm and more the air of an army encampment. They passed a tavern, and in place of the usual songs and laughter customary of such an establishment, Haille heard shouts and steel as a fight either broke out or was broken up. Val and Cody sensed the atmosphere as well, and moved protectively to either side of the gaggle of children. Red marched onward, leading them to a courtyard at the front of the great house. After the last of the children, the horses, and the elk had passed through, the fighters closed the gate behind them and locked it. Red's fighters showed none of the looseness they had exhibited the night before in the caves. Rather, they were the opposite, standing in a circle around the children as if to protect them, or even trap them. Only Red was relaxed, drinking from a flask that had been hidden in her satchel. "Come, come, young ones, to meet my father," she said between tips of the small bottle into her mouth. She wiped her lips with the back of her hand and sucked her breath in between her teeth before leading them into the east wing of the building. Inside was a great hall with a high ceiling supported by wide columns of mortared stone. The rafters were darkened with soot from a fire pit that ran the length of the room. The children lined up along it, pushing and shoving to get close and warm themselves, even though only coals were glowing there. Haille was more interested in the walls lined with broken swords, shattered shields, and captured colors, trophies of battle. And from the sheer number it was clear that Red's father, or his fighters, like Red's, were used to winning. The children settled along the fire pit, crouched down close to the coals, the soft light exaggerating their already diminutive nature, their sunken eyes, their bony frames, beneath clothes that were no more than rags. Red turned up her bottle again for another drink. She was staggering, her face flushed and her eyes heavily lidded, when a double door on the far side of the room opened, and men in boiled leather armor and equipped with clubs and maces entered the room. Val and Cody stiffened. The men lined the walls, their faces obscured by helms made of dark metal, their numbers growing to 24 before Haille lost count. They stood in wide stances, their hands folded over belt buckles, their expressions flat, an impressive display of loyalty and order. But why? Haille wondered. These were their liberators. What need had they to intimidate children? Finally, a tall and slender man appeared in the doorway. He was so tall it seemed unnatural. His head almost touched the keystone of the doorway. His hair was like Red's, so blonde that it was almost white. His, by contrast, was short, its ends sticking up like the teeth of a crown. A cream-colored robe embroidered with silver thread draped his entire figure and shimmered like polished steel as he walked. He stepped down the stairs towards the fire pit, his feet kicking out the edges of his robe, and cupped one of the children's faces in his hand. This was a small boy, one with a deformed arm and only 2 curled, useless fingers. "A beautiful face," he said in a gentle voice, his countenance darkening as he lifted up the stunted arm, the boy turning his eyes to the floor in shame. As if just noticing the other children gathered, he nodded to Red and studied them, his eyes briefly pausing on Val and Cody. "So this is what you brought me," he said in a voice that sounded like a croak from deep in his throat. "The children were the chattel of Quentin Stills. I killed him," Red said. "The 4 there," she said, gesturing to Cody, Val, Katlyn, and Haille, "joined us." Haille wondered if he should say something or perhaps wait for Val to speak. He had not known that such a powerful but unknown lord sponsored Red and her exploits. Although it made sense to him, how else could she continue her raids or arm her fighters without help? So this man was the power behind the legend. Next to the light of the coals, he looked more like a grandfather than father, his face sagging like the wax of a melting candle, his hands covered in age spots. If this was indeed Red's father, Haille wondered how old she was, or how young her mother must have been when wed to this old man. Then again, Red, with those lines around her eyes, was perhaps older than Haille had first guessed. It didn't seem right. Nothing felt right. The guards, the lack of greetings, the way Red was drinking. Haille realized a lump had formed in his throat, and he swallowed just as Red's father began to speak. "Children, you were the property of Quentin Stills. Have no illusion of freedom now, for your lives belong to me, and I, Ghost Redmond, am a harsh master." He stopped, nodded to the boy with the withered arm, and the closest guard stepped forward and in one swift motion smashed in his skull with his club. 1 strike, 2, and a 3rd, and it was over. His dead body fell forward into the coals. The children screamed collectively and rushed for Red, for Val, for Cody. Red stepped back behind the wall of guards who wrestled the children to the floor and began to hogtie them. Val and Cody had no more chance to grab their swords before they were outnumbered and overpowered. Haille took Katlyn by the arm and made for the door they had entered, but 3 men descended upon them. Haille bit one on the exposed wrist and heard him scream behind his mask. He struck Haille with the back of his hand and shook him by the collar of his tunic. The folio page fluttered out of Haille's pocket and drifted down to the floor, a boot stomping down on the image of Jasmine. Haille reached for it, but one of the men twisted Haille's arm behind him, while another picked up the stolen page. "Can you read this, boy?" Haille did not answer until he felt his arm nearly crack. "Oh, yes." "Good. That might be useful." Chapter 17. The Redmont Estate. The dungeon was full of people and silence. Guards led them past rooms rife with the odor of unwashed bodies and overflowing slop buckets. No doors sealed the cells. Instead, inmates were chained to the walls with just enough slack to reach the center of the room where the slop bucket stood. Haille glimpsed men, women, but mostly children, thin, pale, and eyes empty of hope. He was locked into a manacle in a cell identical to all the others and left to stare into the faces of unfamiliar children. One child, one of the ones liberated from Quentin Stills, just 2 days before, protested, "But Avenger Red saved us!" The guards, without speaking, turned on the boy and held him down as they pried open his jaws and cut out his tongue, his teeth clacking against the blade. His cries turned into inarticulate howls of pain as they tore out the flesh by its tendons, then threw it into the slop bucket with a plop. The boy continued to weep, but no further examples were needed. The other prisoners remained silent. The following days were spent waiting while overseers came to assess them. The few adults among them were removed as well as older children. There was little food, only stale bread once a day and water that tasted of chalk. Although Haille was weak and lightheaded with hunger, it was hard to work up an appetite with the odor from the slop bucket filling the cell. Instead, Haille, like the other children, curled up and tried to drift in and out of a shallow daze that was never quite sleep, but never full wakefulness either. On the 3rd day, a guard and key lackey came to him and held a ragged picture of Jasmine in front of him. The page seemed like a scrap of a dream held out to taunt him. "This came from you, no?" the guard said. "Yes." At the guard's signal, the lackey moved close to him with his jingling ring of keys, turned one in Haille's lock, and freed him. "This way," the guard said. Haille followed in silence, his head spinning with hunger and his legs aching from days of being folded beneath him. He searched the other cells as he passed for his friends, but saw only unfamiliar faces or empty manacles. The guard led him up a set of stairs, Haille breathing hard and leaning against the wall for balance. The sun outside was blinding. For a moment, Haille could not tell if it was morning or afternoon. The shadows were long and the sun bright, but the cool air and the mist over the fields told him it was morning. In daylight, he could take in many of the buildings of the estate. They were of timber and wattle construction with slate roofs and smoking chimneys. Everywhere there was movement, girls carrying pails of water or milk, boys leading donkeys laden with everything from bricks to sheaves of wheat to steaming fresh bread loaves. Free of the stench of the dungeons, Haille's mouth watered at the smell of fresh baked goods. Like the dungeon, the estate was strangely quiet. Absent were the greetings, laughter, or even chit-chat among passer-by. It did not take long for Haille to notice that among the women churning butter and milking goats, the men working in fields or laying shingle on the rooftops, or even the children spreading feed for the chickens, there were overseers. Guards like the one leading him, with cruel eyes, studded clubs, and leather whips. The Redmont estate was one of industry and productivity, but run completely on the labor of slaves, stolen slaves. Haille fought back tears. This was where he had led his friends, led himself, and it was worse than any life he could have imagined back at the castle, enduring insults from children and the disapproval of his father. Life in a far-flung orphanage would have been better than this, he realized. Amidst his tears came an anger, a confusion, and a loathing for Avenger Red and her own treachery, his hate for her almost equal to his hate for himself and his own gullibility. The guard did not even check to see if he followed. There was no point in trying to flee. Haille might as well have been in chains. He remembered the curtain wall they had passed through and the earthen fortifications and pickets before that. The guard led him by lines of slaves digging trenches. There were men on these chain gangs. Haille searched their numbers for Val and Cody, but to no avail. He was surprised to be led into the main house, the same building they had been lured into the first fateful night. This time, instead of entering into the long hall in the east wing, the guard walked into the main entrance. The halls beyond were decorated with fine tapestries, polished mirrors, and filigreed candelabrums made of silver, gold, and bronze. The guard looked out of place among the finery, dressed in his sweat-stained shirt and threadbare work trousers. Still, he moved through the hallways as if he was the lord of the manor himself, slave girls scampering out of his way, manservants bowing and groveling to him. Finally, he turned into the room that Haille knew from the scent of parchment, vellum, and candle wax was a library. The room was much too small for the plethora of books inside. They lined the walls to the ceiling. Rolling ladders leaned against shelves to access the highest volumes. Piles of books teetered on the floor and study tables. Among them sat open ledgers and scrap paper covered in calculations. Amid all the clutter was a boy. He looked to be 12 by his facial features, but would have been short for his age. Even standing at the table closest to him, he could not quite reach his arms across it. His sleeves were too long and his collar too wide. He was startled by their entrance, tossed his quill into an inkpot, and dropped his chin to his chest in a perfunctory, subservient bow. Haille noticed a bowl of porridge and a steaming cup of cider next to him on the table. His stomach grumbled. "There's your master, Ratface." "He had to discuss terms with a merchant from Trilham, sir." "Tell him I've brought another scribe for him." He turned to Haille. "You can read, right, boy?" Haille nodded. "Yes, sir." "Good. Listen to Ratface here until Master Redmond returns." Haille swallowed. He had no desire to be near Ghost Redmond again. Once the guard left, Haille put his hand to his shirt to make sure his bite palette was hidden. He did not want to meet the same end as the boy with the crippled arm did at the hands of their master. The other scribe came around the table and offered an ink-stained hand. His eyes were deep pools of sympathy. "Hiya! I'm Rimmeld, but most everyone calls me Rim." "Derek," Haille said without hesitating, unsure if his real identity would be an asset or liability in such a den of outlaws. "You have come from the dungeons," Rim said, a statement, not a question. "You must be hungry. Here." Rim offered his bowl of porridge. "You sure?" "Go ahead. I remember my first days too. They keep you underfed so you're weak and won't resist. They cut a boy's tongue out in the dungeon for speaking." "I don't doubt," Rim said, handing the bowl to Haille with 2 hands. Haille thanked him and set to devouring it, his spoon scraping the sides with vigor. "I heard Redmond smash the head of a crippled boy too." Haille nodded. "Master Redmond hates weakness. You'll find no flawed specimens among his stock." "Is that what we are now?" Haille said, his spoon stopping mid-scrape. "It is what we all are," Rim said, moving back around the table. He rolled his sleeve over his forearm to reveal a simple ram's head inked on the underside. "But we have little ways of remembering who we really are." He dipped the quill in the inkpot and applied a few drops to the symbol on his arm. "My family's coat of arms. My father was a sheep trader outside of Falham." "How did you end up here?" "Raiders came down from the mountains. They burned the village. My brother went out to fight. I stayed back with my sister hiding in a field. I'm no use fighting. Books and ledgers, yes. Fighting, no," he said, twisting his mouth. "But 2 raiders came into the field. Must have seen our tracks. They were coming close to both me and my sister. I jumped up, ran as fast as I could to lead them away from her. They caught me, but not her." He took another dip in the inkwell. "Hopefully my brother survived and found her." He paused in his effort to darken the symbol on his arm, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand holding the quill. A stray drop of ink left a streak on his jaw. Haille had nearly finished the bowl of porridge, and afraid of taking advantage of his new companion's generosity, he moved to place it back on the table with some of the contents remaining. Rim, who was reaching again for the inkwell, flicked his hand to encourage Haille to finish. The motion was ill-timed, for he knocked the well over on its side, and dark blue-black liquid poured forth on the table. "Drat!" Rim said, his face suddenly pale and stricken. "Master Redmond will beat me." He scrambled around the table, picking up a few scrap sheets of parchment to fold up and use to stop the spreading pool of ink. The paper was not absorbent enough, and he pulled the end of his shirt from his trousers and began to dab at the ink with it, making more a mess of his clothes and hands. He froze when he heard the sound of footsteps accompanied by a sharp tap-tap sound coming from the hallway. Ghost Redmond appeared in the door. In the bright morning light streaming in the windows, Haille could see his eyes were a flinty gray, similar to the steel-colored stone that made up the buildings of his estate. His nose was webbed with red blood vessels, his cheeks sunken and flaking with dry skin. In his hand was a long walking stick with a metal foot on its tapered end. "What mess have you made now, Rim?" he said in a phlegmy voice that came right from his throat. His knuckles turned white where they clutched the walking stick. Haille felt a surge of protectiveness and stepped between them. "I am sorry, Master Redmond. I knocked over the inkwell." The strike with the walking staff came faster than he expected. Haille put up his arm to deflect the second blow. Both hurt, but were nothing worse than he had experienced in the fencing ring. "Once for talking out of turn, twice for insolence, and thrice for clumsiness," Master Redmond said, striking Haille a third and final time. Haille kept his head bowed and wondered if the itching he felt on his face was a trickle of sweat or blood. He dared not move to check. Master Redmond was breathing heavily now, having spent the best of his efforts. "Who are you?" he wheezed. "Derek of Castlebridge," Haille said. "Derek of nowhere," Master Redmond said. "You are my property now." "Yes, master," Haille said, the words of subservience like poison in his mouth. "Why is he here?" Master Redmond looked at Rim. "He can write," Rim said. The guard had left the page from the folio. "This was taken off him," Rim said, holding out the picture of Jasmine and moving to Haille's side, his hand on his shoulder. "Is that right?" Redmond snatched the page from Rim's hand, unfolded it and studied the writing on the opposite side, his lips moving as he did so. When he was finished, he thrust it in front of Haille's face. "What is a runt like you doing with something like this? You like the picture, or can you read it?" "I can read, sir." "Prove it." Redmond shook the page in front of his face. "The font of Jasmine grants the wish of a crippled child, the friendly pilgrim who seeks favour of the lady." "With a city accent, too. Where were you educated, boy?" "Havisham Academy," Haille said, making up the name of an academy he hoped would fool Redmond. "Never heard of it, but it will be useful to have 2 scribes instead of 1. He clapped his hands, and a female servant, an apple-shaped woman with a bonnet over her grey hair, entered. "Hilda, clean up this mess. I'm taking these rats to do inventory." Lord Redmond did business in other wares beside humans, Haille quickly learned, accompanying the master of the estate to his wine cellars, ice houses, slaughterhouses, and smithies. His obsession for keeping accurate records ran deep, and Haille could tell Rim was glad to have help. They would often check their counts against one another and soon developed a shorthand consisting of looks, nods, and shakes, not to mention figures shown on their fingers, anything short of speaking, for Lord Redmond tolerated no distractions while he counted his barrels, boxes, and bodies. The master kept close watch over all parts of his estate, and therefore Haille saw every stretch of it. This granted him opportunity to search for his friends. Katlyn he found among a group of slave girls churning butter on the dairy farm. He was flooded with relief to see her and to know that she had not been sold off. It was possible to make eye contact with her, but little more. Once she saw him standing behind Redmond, ledger in hand, she looked away. Haille was uncertain if this was simply to protect their relationship from discovery, or if it was out of resentment that this was where his trust in Avenger Red had brought them. "I've been such a fool." Val and Cody he found after 2 weeks. They had been set to repair parts of the curtain wall where a creek had undermined its foundation. Neither saw him, but he took note of their overseer, Travis Ogman, in case he showed up in the office seeking a writ to travel, which would mean he would be taking his slaves to auction. Where these auctions took place was a mystery to Haille, since slavery was outlawed in the realm, but Rim had answers. At night they would whisper what they knew to one another. Ever since Haille had taken a beating for Rim, they had been fast friends. Rim had offered to share his room, a small alcove in the attic afforded to him as a scribe, and Haille had accepted. It was cold and drafty, but better than the dungeon. "Slavery is outlawed in the realm of Anthor," Rim explained, "but not in other realms. The The slaves can't be shipped through the port of Carrisons. Instead, they go out of Black Cove Bay. It is north of Carrisons, and they reach it through secret roads through the Worthern Forest. And of course, Master Redmond has an inventory of every mercenary and crooked man for hire throughout the realm, so the slaves are escorted without too much harm. He protects his investment. If the High Council knew of it, they would act to stop it. They do know. At least some members do. But Redmond keeps them paid off. He accounts for bribes in the ledgers just like any other expense. And in the meantime, Red goes about stealing from their competitors and killing them if they are too successful. But who spreads the stories that she is a hero? The Redmonds themselves, of course, Rim said. They have plants and taverns and inns across the kingdom. I guess he has accounts for them as well, Haille said. Indeed. It's a genius enterprise, even if it's criminal. No doubt. Haille felt depressed. The web of evil entangling his world was growing only more formidable. Vondales, Avenger Red, the High Council. Chapter 18. Gale Redmond. In his quiet moments, Haille would play through scenarios where his father and Yana would raid the estate, execute the guards and overseers, and put Ghost Redmond into chains for the rest of his life. But the villain Haille loathed the most was Red herself, who had played him for such a naive fool and who had taken advantage of so many trusting children. Yet for all her notoriety outside the estate, she was mostly absent from it, except for the times she would return from her raids with a new band of children, flocking to her like animals unaware they are heading to the slaughterhouse. After one of these raids, she came to the library to meet with her father. She took wide, uneven steps, as she was already well into her flask of spirits. Rim moved himself behind a stack of books and avoided her gaze. Haille kept his head down, staring intently into a ledger, although the moment Red had walked in, his concentration was lost. How he yearned for a dirk or a blade of any type to jump at her from behind when her guard was down. He felt his face twitch, and his fingers gripped the quill in his hand so tightly that it cracked. "The raids go well," Redmond said. "I have brought you 17 children with the last lot, 6 girls of childbearing age." "And whom did we strike?" "Marmorswade. He won't be in business any longer." Redmond paused. "You killed him?" Red nodded and looked at the front and the back of her hands. She rubbed her knuckles as if she noticed dried blood there. "He has a son who might be continuing the business after his father's death," Redmond said. No, he won't be," Red said. Her father leaned back heavily in his chair and sighed, his breath disrupting the papers before him. "I don't remember eradicating family lines to be a part of our plan for profit. These are pigs and worms that are standing in defiance of your monopoly." "Yes, and without them we'll have to go about capturing slaves on our own. Would you have the same success attacking villages as you do abusing wagons with a ragtag bunch of brainwashed child soldiers?" "You said yourself that we should be feared." "You should be feared. Me, revered. I have to do business with these men when we are not double-crossing them. If they realize their most feared enemy is actually the daughter of one of their business partners, we risk all of them uniting against us. Keep them off balance with a few raids, but allow them some wins, lest we kill the goose that lays us the golden eggs." "You would have us be a parasite to these scoundrels." "I would have us be shepherds of wolves. We must know when to cull the flock and when to let it breed. Do we have a clear understanding, Gale?" She leaned forward over the table, oblivious to her father's question, her attention diverted. "What is this?" she asked. Haille saw that she had picked up the page of the Font of Jasmine, where it had been left in a pile of unfiled papers. "Something one of the slaves, this one, had on him." Red looked at Haille, noticing him for the first time. "You! I remember you! The Elk Rider! Where did you get this?" Haille hesitated. He had been able to dodge the question of where he had found it when her father had asked him before. "I bought it for a pence from a boy who stole it from a library." "Why?" "I thought it was nice to look at." "Where did you learn to read?" she asked, studying him with those eyes set in spiderwebs of wrinkles, so incongruous on her young body. Havisham Academy.
Gael, if you are finished interrogating the slave, we have an understanding to reach.
She bristled at the sound of her father's voice, or perhaps it was the use of her real name. Her knuckles popped as she clenched and unclenched her fists. I'm done, and we're done too, she said, turning and tossing the page back onto his desk before she swept out of the room. The cold steel of a knife at his throat woke Haille. He knew better than to call out for help, but even if he had, there was a hand clamped down over his mouth. Come with me. Try anything and you're dead, a voice whispered in his ear. Rim's soft breathing continued next to him, undisturbed. Haille shifted on the mattress of corn husks and placed his feet on the floor. The knife withdrew, but he didn't need it touching his skin to know it was still poised close. Put on your shoes, the voice said, and his boots were thrust into his lap. He did as he was told, straining to keep quiet as he did so. He tied up the laces, then stood. Down the ladder. Haille obeyed, crawling down the ladder out of the attic alcove where he and Rim slept. The figure slid down after him, took him by the collar, and guided him down the hallway to the steps to the first floor and then outside. The moon was a waxing gibbous and cast light on the stone of the courtyard as they crossed it. At the corner of the manor, his companion turned him towards the vineyards where Haille marched, wondering, if required, could he lose his captor in the grapevines? But they did not get more than a few steps into the trellises before he was seized by the shoulder, spun around, and found himself looking into the face of Avenger Red. You, he blurted. Keep your voice hushed, she said, or else we'll be discovered. What do you want with me? I want to know what you were doing with that page on the font of Jasmine. I told you. You lied. She shook him by the collar and yanked free his bite palette. The leather shone in the moonlight, revealing the multiple crescents left there by his teeth. Want to try again? I'm no fool. I know what the font does. How? Every crippled, sick child hears stories of the font. Even me. But you, what's wrong with you? Haille asked. She lowered the knife. He heard it slip back into its sheath. How old do you think I am, Derek? 2 years my elder? Try 2 times your elder. I'm 32. Haille stared at her face, looking for some sign of deceit, some hint of a smirk or a nervous twitch to betray the lie, but he saw none. She was no taller than he, and although he had met grown women who were short, she still had much the appearance of a young maiden. Except the eyes. Haille realized it was not just the fine lines around them that gave her a hint of age, but the hardness he saw there. Her fearlessness, her capacity to lead, even her striking lack of sentiment suddenly made sense. I stopped growing around my 11th birthday, she continued. I'm a dwarf. It works well for the legend of a child vigilante, but in life, it is a curse. I am a woman trapped in the body of a child. My father could not be more ashamed. No, ashamed does not even begin to describe his loathing, his disgust. But he trusts you to raid the slave trains. Trusts me, fears me, reviles me. You saw what he did to that crippled boy. There is no room for the broken, the less than, in his world. Then why does he still tolerate me? It's hard to believe, but he did love once, and I'm the only thing left of her. My mother died when I was an infant. Haille swallowed. My mother died in childbirth. My father, everyone still blames me for it. She looked at him askance, as if wondering whether or not he was lying again. It does not help that I look like her, people tell me, Haille continued. Or that you suffer from the shaking sickness? I do. So what are you doing with the page? She stared intently at him. We're going to find the font. I want to be healed. I knew it, she said, punctuating her sentence with a punch to his arm. You think you can find it? The page says where it is, generally. Take me. Take you? You betrayed me and my friends. I could make you, she said, and Haille felt cold all over. He knew she was right. But I doubt you could get us through the Aislands. You could, I suppose, Haille asked. The lands between here and Rivertown are not friendly to the Redmond clan, but there is someone who does know the lands and has been planning an escape for months. Haille did not follow her, and she perceived as much. I'm talking about Rim, she said. Rim? Even if he was planning, nothing escapes my father's notice. He has spies everywhere. Rim has been talking, asking about the lands to the east. He has even been stealing table scraps. Look under his bed sometime. You'll find all sorts of supplies. Even if he were planning an escape, what do I have to do with it? He trusts you. You need to get him to trust me. Trust you? That's laughable. I can make sure your friends are released. Haille stiffened. I have your attention now. How can I trust you? Because I'm a freak, like you. Not good enough. Fine, don't trust me. Don't act until your friends are released. But then you will have to talk to Rym into taking both of us through the river valley to Rivertown. And you will need me to get past the pickets surrounding this place. My friends have to be set free. I'll have them shipped back to Antis. Even your elk. Haille weighed the offer. He did not like to part with his friends, but if they could be free and safe, and he unencumbered, then perhaps it was no dilemma at all. I will speak with Rym. Haille waited a few days until he and Rym were left alone in the library together. Rym made no effort to try to conceal his plans for escape when Haille confronted him. Just as Red had predicted, Rym trusted him. He was actually eager to have Haille as a companion and conspirator. Rym was not willing to trust Red, however. She's a liar, a slaver, and a murderer, Rym said. That's all true, but she's also a freak. I'll say, Rym said, putting down his quill. Like me, Haille said, holding out his bite palette. You? Yes. I have the shaking sickness. My friends were helping me find the font so I could be cured. Rym rubbed his chin. So you trust her? She has promised to let my friends go. I will believe it when I see it. But the day came. Early in the dawn, when the stars were still fading into the coming light of morning, Haille and Rym gathered, shivering, outside the curtain wall on pretense of counting slaves as they headed out into the fields to work. A chattel wagon pulled by oxen rolled up out of the mist from the direction of the dungeons. Meanwhile, a guard appeared at the gate, with a lean-looking girl by his side, her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, her skirt tattered at the edges and stiff with sweat and dirt. Haille was shocked to realize it was Katlyn. The weeks in captivity had hollowed out her cheeks, and her eyes were sunken like so many of the other malnourished slaves, but they welled up with tears upon seeing Haille. The wagon neared. A driver sat on the bench, and in a plain brown cloak beside him was Red. 3 horses trailed behind, the bridles lashed to the corner of the wagon, and a 4th creature was chained as well. The elk. It turned its eyes on Haille and Katlyn before shaking its head and huffing at Red as she swung down from the bench to untie the horses. The guard that led Katlyn out took them by the bridles. Haille grabbed Katlyn by the elbow and led her towards the wagon door. What's going on? She asked. I'm getting you out of here. What? Just follow along. Red was giving instructions to the driver and handed him an envelope sealed with the mark of her father, which Haille had grown used to seeing on official documents from the library. The driver slipped the envelope into his breast pocket, climbed down from the bench, and walked to the back of the wagon where he unlocked the door and stood aside to allow Haille to look inside. Haille heard the rattle of chains before he made out the shapes of Val and Cody on the benches. Oh, bless my eyes, Cody said. Haille guided Katlyn up the steps into the wagon. What is going on here? Val said, looking at Red, who stood off to the side. A deal, Haille said. Your freedom if I help Red find the fountain too. You made a deal with her? For your freedom. And you trust her? I gave him my word, Red spat. Now Rym, mount your pony. There is a network of people east of here who help escape slaves, Haille said to Val. Rym knows the way. And us? You would just bargain us away so easily? Val said. Haille was surprised. I've won your freedom. Val lifted the chains. It doesn't feel like it yet. It feels like divide and conquer, but what Red is up to, I can't guess. You just have to ride in the chattel wagon until you are free of Redmont's lands. Then you can be released, and you can return to the city. Derek, it's time to go, Red said. Val glared at her over Haille's head. He lowered his voice. Don't separate yourself from your pack, young man. This is my only choice, Haille said, a sense of frustration growing within him. He had expected Val and the others to be grateful. Anyway, I still have a pack. Aye, and I don't trust half of it. Val sat back on the bench across from Cody, who had his arm around Katlyn. I don't like being a pawn. I hope you know what you are doing. I do, Haille said, closing the door. The driver stepped up beside him, locked it shut, and then returned to the bench where he snapped the reins and the oxen began to draw the wagon away down the road with the elk, lashed to the back, following. Under his breath, Haille added, I think. Chapter 19. Juniper Cottage. The guards at the picket drew their swords, steel flashing dimly in the weak morning light, but they recognized Red riding on her white stallion, even if her usual red adornments were missing. Her hair, her bearing, and her horse were unmistakable, not to mention the crow that alighted on her shoulder and never seemed far from her side. She fed him sunflower seeds from a pouch on her belt, in much the same way Haille fed his own jays. Without question, the guards saluted her and stood aside for her to ride past. Rym and Haille followed. Shortly after, they rode clear of the trees of the forest and onto a road with fields on either side. Red shook her arm, sending the crow into the air where it circled above them. Rym looked over his shoulder at the woods from where they had emerged. Relax, Red said. You're with me. They will be sounding no alarm at your escape. I just don't truly feel free yet, Rym said, then turned forward in his saddle to the east where the clouds were fringed with pink. Haille shared his preoccupation. After even less time trapped at the estate than Rym, Haille felt a strange anxiety leaving, as if guards and overseers would appear with a cadre of men to ride them down, capture, and beat them. But no such hunting party materialized. Instead, they cantered onward without incident and without words, passing only the occasional sharecroppers headed out to fields to harvest, scythes balanced on their shoulders. As hard as it was to believe, they were all three traveling as equals, companions at least, so Red had insisted. She had given them both knives, albeit small, and even a short sword to Haille. Rym, not having any training, turned down the offer of a sword and took a mace instead. Not that they would need the weapons, Red insisted. Few thieves dared to practice their trade in the shadow of Redmont Manor, but Red did remind them that she had many enemies. And as companions, we're also compatriots, and I'd like to know you two have my back in a fight. So they were simply to trust one another. No small task for Rym or Haille, since Red had betrayed them both. But Haille looked at her with new eyes now. She was a freak, like him, and he sensed that because he trusted her, so did Rym. The rising sun dazzled their eyes throughout the morning as they rode. The day was a warm one, perhaps the last of the year, Haille reckoned. By midday their ponies' coats were dark with sweat, and their own brows damp. Rym eventually took the lead as he was the one who knew the signs that escaped slaves used to find their way to friendlier land. Mostly the trick seemed to be to head due east. Slaves on the run would be on foot, and would likely keep to unharvested fields where they could easily hide from sight. The three of them had the advantage of being horsed, and riding in the open where they could make good time. In the afternoon they came upon a small river, not much more than a swollen creek, but it was too deep to ford where they had come upon it. After studying the landscape for some minutes, Rym announced that they were to head north. Red fell into line without question, snapping off a few willow branches and weaving them into a bracelet as she rode. While she was occupied, Rym came alongside Haille and leaned in close. Don't be obvious when you look, but hanging from that cottonwood ahead is a string with a white river stone braided into it. Those are the markers we are looking for. Haille noted the stone, twisting in the breeze. It was looped over the third branch up on the trunk, the limbs dark against the bright golden leaves. Once pointed out to him, Haille found the markers easily enough. There was a pattern of hanging them and placing the stone relative to the branch and the trunk that indicated direction, although the exact symbolism of it Rym kept to himself. Near nightfall, they came to a shallow ford, crossed the river, and then Rym announced they would camp for the night. They lit no fire, and they ate only biscuits and smoked meat. They had started out early with the release of Haille's friends. He wondered about them now, and hoped they had been freed from the back of the wagon. It felt strange to be separated from them, like something was missing. He could not help the sense in the back of his mind that he had forgotten something, like leaving a door open behind him, or leaning back in bed only to find one's pillow missing from its accustomed place. It was an absence not filled by his present companions. But as he fell asleep, he told himself that this was better, to be less attached, to be less vulnerable, less encumbered. Only he was in danger now, not his friends, and alone he could accomplish more. Haille woke to rain snapping on leaves all around him. The good luck they had experienced the day before had run out. They had slept in the open and there was no hiding from the rain. So they rolled up their blankets and resumed their trek, their hoods up, their heads down, and their shoulders slumped while the rain proceeded to soak them through. Haille was shivering and cold when they came upon a sharecropper's plot, with a cottage nestled among high junipers heavy with blueberries. A line of cottonwoods marched out into the adjacent field, and from their branches hung 3 blue clay bottles. "We'll be safe here," Rym announced. They rode until they were at the edge of the property, and then stopped just beneath the hanging bottles. Haille would have preferred stopping under the eaves of the cottage or even the barn, but Rym insisted that they remain under the bottles, their sides dark with moisture, their bottoms beaded with hanging drops. Fortunately, it was not long before the man of the house, a weather-beaten fellow with as many lines on his face as summers he had passed in the fields, trudged out under a cloak, accompanied by 2 young men close to Haille's age. The farmer greeted them, his eyes flashing brightly under his hood, his smile marred by missing teeth, but no less welcoming for it. The hand he raised in a wave was leathery and gnarled. The sound of rain was drowned out by a croak of Red's crow. It had returned and alighted on her outstretched arm. "We seek the refuge you offer to those who flee their chains," Rym said. "You are the first to come on horseback and by daylight," he said. "But you know the words and our customs. You're welcome." And they were. The old man introduced himself as Wilson. The boys' names Haille was too weary and too cold to catch, but they took their horses and stabled them in the barn. Rym, who had taken the lead of their small group, handled introductions. Haille was still Derek, and Red was Gale. Haille could not help a wince of guilt at the deception as Wilson's wife, Lilith, a stout woman with snow-white braids and a sanguine face, fussed over all of them, insisting that they change into dry clothes and settle down next to the fire while she prepared a stew. It could not come quickly enough, Haille thought, his stomach grumbling and his limbs still shivering as he settled down next to the hearth. Wilson's children and grandchildren were too many to count. Some lived with them, some were visiting to help with the harvest. The younger ones took turns holding Red's crow. They giggled with excitement when it would repeat their words. Red was content enough to pass the time with them, for she had little to say to Wilson or his wife. They spoke of the horrors of the slave trade and recounted the stories they had heard from escaped slaves. "Most are children," Lilith said. "We've only heard of a few being caught again," Lilith said. "We hope and pray at night that they have reached their home safely." "Many are from the north. They have a long road ahead of them," Wilson said, settling into a chair with a reclining back next to the fire. One of the boys put a stool in front of him for his feet, and a granddaughter brought him a pipe, already packed with pipeweed. There was no doubt that he was his own sort of patriarch, king even, among his brood in his cottage surrounded by junipers. Rym warmed to the entire family, exclaiming that he was also from the north. Haille and Red gave vague answers regarding their own origins. If Wilson or Lilith were suspicious, they showed no sign. However, they were keen to observe that all 3 of them appeared well-fed and were fortunate to have escaped with horses. "We all 3 were working in the manor as bookkeepers. Our lives were easier than those who work in the fields and the shops," Rym said. He could not help a quick glare in Red's direction. "We had freedom of movement on the plantation and knew just where to procure horses." "A shame you couldn't have freed more slaves along with yourselves," Wilson said between puffs on his pipe. Smoke rings rose in the air over his head. "Yes, a shame," Rym said. "Shame! Shame! Shame!" the crow echoed. The children laughed, but when their laughter died, a silence fell over them all. Haille cleared his throat but found that he had nothing to say, especially with Red sitting next to him, frowning at her bird. Finally, Lilith broke the silence, tapping the edge of her pot with a wooden spoon. "Stew's ready." The next morning was noisy with the sound of wind rattling the shutters of the house and swirling eddies of leaves outside. Haille, Rym, and Red had slept beside the hearth. The fire had burned down to coals, and Haille, although awake, did not stir from his blankets until he heard the pop of Wilson's footsteps on the stairs. His companion slept, or feigned sleep, a bit longer while Wilson laid fresh kindling in the fireplace. Haille helped, blowing on the coals, and soon the fire was cracking. With more feet pattering on the stairs, it was impossible for Rym and Red to remain as they were. Both stirred but had few words for the other. Wilson put a kettle over the fire and crushed pine needles to make tea while some of his grandchildren set the table and others went outside to feed the animals and fetch fresh water from the well. Lilith joined them and produced a deep dish of flaky cake from some place in the pantry. "Honey cakes!" the children cried, seeing the cake.
"Honey cakes! Honey cakes!"
the crow croaked. Lilith encouraged Haille, Rym, and Red to eat seconds and even wrapped extra slices in cloth for them and insisted that they pack them away in their bags. After finishing their cups of tea, they went outside to where their horses had been saddled and prepped by some of the older grandchildren. It was not easy to leave the warmth and welcome of Lilith and Wilson's home. The wind that sent showers of leaves into the air and kicked up chaff and dust at their feet had an edge to it, hinting at the coming of winter. Red's crow teetered in the gusts before catching the wind and soaring off into the sky, becoming a speck against the slate-gray clouds that denied them even the warmth of the morning sun. Wilson and two of his grandsons rode them to the edge of his property. Red was silent, while Wilson spoke of their determination to continue to help other refugees from the Redmond estate. Finally, at the crossroads that marked the extreme of his land, he bid them farewell, with instructions to the next stop along the secret route.
"You ride east until you reach a patch of forest, and you'll head south for a spell until you reach a ravine, with high bluffs of either side. You can't miss it. Follow the trail into the woods there, and the next folks, well, they will find you."
Haille and Rym thanked Wilson profusely, and even Red muttered a few words of appreciation, though it was not clear if these were sincere or simply for show. Nevertheless, they rode in silence for much of the blustery day, breaking only once to eat honey cakes and to water the horses. They reached the forest in the afternoon, although it felt later with the sun still behind the lid of clouds. Wilson had been right. The entrance to the ravine was unmistakable, with high granite walls rising on either side, scraggly pines holding on ledges, their branches whistling in the wind. Red's crow returned to her shoulder as they entered, its caws echoing off the rising walls. "I don't like this place," Red said. "Too exposed in sight and limited in escape." "The perfect place for an ambush," Rym said.
"Ambush!"
the crow croaked. And so it was. Haille heard a whistle that was more human than that of wind or bird. Before he could determine the direction it came from, an arrow cut through the air and stuck into the path ahead of them. The horses startled. Red drew her sword, shook the crow off her shoulder, and sent it flapping up, past the rim of the ravine where figures were already gathering, emerging from behind rocks and bushes, their longbows trained on the three of them. "Drop your sword," Rym said, pulling his mace from his sling and dropping it to the ground. Haille tossed his sword and Red finally complied, but not without a look of disgust. There were too many boys to count as they emerged from every nook and cranny around and above them. They cut off the path ahead and behind them and moved in close to take their weapons and grab the bridles of their horses. "We come seeking refuge," Rym announced. "On the ground," an older boy with the beginnings of a beard ordered. They obeyed, slipping from their mounts and raising their hands before them. "By the stars above!" one of the boys exclaimed, recognizing Red. The others immediately gathered around her, a dozen arrows and even more blades pointed in her direction. She put on a brave face, her chin thrust forward into the air, but Haille noticed her throat flutter. "She helped us escape," Haille offered. "She even got us the horses." "Well, that is something different," the boy with the scraggly beard said. "Stephen, you will want to see this for yourself." He called up to a clutch of boys higher up on the cliffside. Soon the whole pack of them was gathered about Haille, Rym, and Red. A taller boy, a young man really, with a bush of curly hair and a patch of beard on his chin came forward. Like the others, his clothes were worn and tattered, patched haphazardly in places with mismatched cloth. The sleeves were stiff with sweat and worn shiny with work. But these boys stood with a certain confidence, pride even, that the other slaves at the manor did not. It was the swagger of freedom, and it was not lost on Red, who took a step backwards until her shoulders touched her horse. "This one is not welcome," the one with the curly hair whom they called Stephen said. He looked at Red but spoke to Haille and Rym. "I've grown ashamed of the part I played in an evil trade," Red spoke. It was the most she had said all day since leaving Wilson and Lilith's. "I place myself at your mercy." Although they were armed like men, the boys showed their inexperience, their eyes open wide and searching one another for an indication as to what to do next. Even Stephen was at a loss, no words coming out of his mouth at first, until he regained some composure and at least chose to give the decision about Red to someone else.
"Blindfold them and take their horses. We'll bring them to Julian."
They marched the remainder of the day through forests, or at least Haille guessed as much from the swish of branches, the crunch of pine needles underfoot, and the smell of evergreen trees. A few times the boys spun them around in circles to further disorient them. Haille knew they had reached a camp of some sort when the scents and sounds around them changed. There was the odor of sweaty bodies, poorly dug latrines, and cooking fires, along with the clamor of voices, even shouts as others recognized Red. The three of them were made to kneel while their blindfolds were removed. A tent city appeared before them. This was no nomadic camp. The paths were well worn, the camp stocked with feed, animals, and watchtowers. By the puzzlement in their faces, Haille could tell Red and Rym were as surprised by their surroundings as he. They were no longer in the depths of a forest, but rather on the edge of a cultivated field. A long manor house stood off in the distance with accompanying barn, outbuilding, and silos. "Where are we?" Rym asked. "The camp of lost children of Freedom Town, as we like to call it," a lanky young man said, striding up to them. He was dressed much like the others, his sleeves rolled up as if he had just come from the fields, a bit of chaff stuck here and there on his clothes, and his chest was shining with sweat. He recognized Rym and immediately embraced him. "Rimald, you've finally escaped." "Julian Cosworth! So you're the Julian they spoke of at the ravine," Rym said, laughing.
"I've been here the longest, so I'm the chief, for what it's worth."
His eyes darkened and he looked upon Haille and Red.
"You've brought us an unlikely hostage."
"And even less likely ally," Rym said.
"She helped us escape."
"Did you, gal?" Julian said. "I've renounced my father, his work, and our family.
You can renounce all you want. That does not erase the wrongs you've done."
Red said nothing but looked instead at the ground. It was the biggest show of humility Haille had seen from her. The conversation stopped. Julian, like Stephen before him, shook his head, partly in disbelief and partly at a loss as to what to do next. It was Rym who broke the silence.
"What are you all doing here? How do you survive?"
"Well," Julian said, brightening and helping Rym to his feet.
"You can see Greystone Manor on the rise there. Solsta Greystone had been our partner of sorts, sheltering us while we work in his fields these past years that we've been free."
"You've traded one yoke for another?" Red asked.
"Hardly,"
Stephen said from the crowd of boys that encircled them. Some of the other boys snorted.
"Old man Solsta paid us, like any good lord ought to. It's not much, but it's better than being slaves," Julian said. "Solsta is a liar and a cheat. He's signed a pact with my father to return any slaves."
"And has he?" Julian said, looking down at Red.
"He said he has found none." "That's because we ain't slaves, we're free!"
a girl shouted to a chorus of,
"Yeah!"
A glob of spit landed on Red's face. She wiped it away with her sleeve. Haille had the sense of things unraveling. The wrong move, wrong word, and he could see Red strung up in a tree burning over a pyre. Or both. Julian put his hands up for calm.
"Is she that far from the truth, friends? For we know Solsta, before he passed, had not honoured his agreement in full. He has provided food and shelter for us, but the ledger for our salaries is still red."
"You have not been paid?" Rym asked. Julian sighed.
"The contract was for 2 years of work, and with the money we saved we would be able to buy passage north on barges to return to our homes. The journey is too dangerous to make on foot. We'll just be captured by raiders again."
"But Solsta is dead?" Red asked.
"About a month ago. His twin boys, Reginald and Remus, don't seem inclined to honour the contract. They are as corrupt as the Redmonds," Stephen spat.
Red's cheek twitched, but she flexed her jaw and said nothing.
"What is the reasoning behind the delay?" Rym asked. "They have amended the contract, claiming we must remain another 2 years before we are paid," Julian said.
"Have you challenged them?" Rym asked.
"With what? The law? It's not as if we live in the shadow of the city here in the Eastlands. But there must be some recourse. We came here hoping that we could go farther.
I want to go home, Rym said. There is another way that we have been unsuccessful at so far, Julian said, rubbing his chin. We've challenged the brothers to a duel of honour, which being spoiled nobles they are more than eager to meet. It's just that none of us have been able to best them. He turned and lifted his shirt to reveal a purple bruise marbled on his side. Other boys turned up their sleeves to show more bruises and cuts. 2 removed straw hats to reveal stitches in their scalps. The girls gathered in the crowd tisked. The twins make for rough opponents in the fighting ring, for now they have us by the neck. More curses came from the crowd, followed by more spitting. Haille did not want the rage and frustration turned on him or, more likely, Red. Rym had yet to introduce him to the others, and unlike Rym, he knew none of the other ex-slavers. He had to find allies himself and quickly, for he could ill afford to be stranded here in the camp while the font waited. He looked to Red, made a calculation in his head, then cleared his throat. Rym, Master Julian. All eyes turned to him. Rym rushed to introduce him. This is Derek. He worked the books with me at the manor. You have something to say, Derek? Julian said. I do, Haille said, his face burning. He stood up slowly, for he wanted to be on his feet for what he said next. The twins. I'll fight them for you. Laughter. Incredulous laughter all around him. Haille was small for his age, but he had calculated the odds. He kept his face still and somber. Julian walked up to him, his face a question mark. Haille only came up to his shoulders, a detail not lost on Julian as he looked Haille from head to foot. So you will face the brothers for us? If it means freedom and passage east, yes. Both of them, yes. Alone? No, he said, now reaching his hand under Red's arm and drawing her up. Red, Gale, whatever you want to call her, she will fight with me. Chapter 20. Reginald and Remus Greystone. The fighting square was drawn in a clearing between 2 fields. A shelter stood nearby, an opening in its thatched roof for smoke from a fire below. It was a shelter for field hands, and this space, where the escaped children would rest between long turns in the rows of barley, where they gathered for warming their hands around the fire or cooling their bodies in the shade, was a sort of neutral ground. A place surrounded by the expansive fields of the Greystone clan, but an island that the hired help felt belonged to them, at least in spirit. It was physically halfway between the manor house and the camp where the escapees made their home, which by all intents would be a temporary one if Haille and Red won their bout that morning. The 2 of them sat off to the side alone together. Rym had brought them porridge and cider to wash it down, but Haille's stomach was in knots. You should eat, Red said, scooping up the last of her own breakfast with her fingers and sucking it off with a slurp. You will need your strength for the match. Haille took in a deep draught of air through his nose to fill his lungs, and he imagined it filling his belly as well before he let it out in a long sigh. Even drinking his cider took effort. I always have nerves before a fight, he said, although he had never had nerves like this. Never had he had so much riding on a match, nor had he ever entered knowing so little of his opponents. I'll settle once the fighting begins. At least he had in previous fights against the swordsmen Yana had made him train with and against other boys in the academy. Thanks to Master Ivan, the ring was one of the few places Haille could face a fair fight. But if all he heard of the twins was true, then this would not be much of a fair fight. The boys who had fought against them before harbored little hope, and the other escapees who gathered with them were quiet, their faces wan like mourners attending a funeral. Rym at least was encouraging to Haille, and even Red, smiling with one side of his mouth as he handed them their porridge that morning. Unlike the others, he had never seen the twins, so he could afford to hope. But Haille had seen Red fight. He had heard the stories, and although much about her had been false, he knew her skills were real. That, with his training, gave him slight reason not to despair. Those reasons evaporated like morning mist as the twins appeared on horseback, accompanied by their retinue of squires, servants, and banner-bearers. They were attended to like knights marching off to tournament, and they were dressed for it too. Both wore breastplates and pauldrons over boiled leathers. Their limbs were protected by gauntlets and greaves, their armor gilded and polished to shine. It was an ostentatious display of wealth considering they had yet to pay their field hands, all the more so because there were 2 of them. The only difference between them was that one brother wore a gorget around his neck and the other did not. Even without the armor, they were giants, one a spitting image of the other, each with thick torso, short neck, and wide jaw flexed into matching frowns. Most notable to Haille were their long, thick limbs, which meant reach and power. They certainly made for good theater. If it left any impression on Red, she did not show it. Instead, she downed her cider and followed it with a belch. She offered a broken smirk, followed by a snort in which she cleared her nose. Well, you've really gotten us into it, haven't you, Derek? The twins dismounted with the help of squires and lumbered into a corner of the square. Haille and Red proceeded to theirs, unarmored. A servant dressed in a linen tunic with the green and gold colors of the house approached them. He must have been an overseer or a clerk of some sort, for Julian and the others knew him and shared no love for him, the others sneering and spitting as he approached.
Will your champions require weapons? He asked.
Yes, Haille answered when Julian looked unprepared for the question.
We will need training swords.
Of course, the clerk said.
We have many to provide.
Haille cursed inwardly at the word many. The one thing he had counted on for advantage was that the twins, far out from the city and in the thinly populated Eastlands, would not have been trained. But if they possessed many training swords, perhaps they were. Haille and Red's advantages, already few, were diminishing quickly. The brothers took seats upon their stools while their servants checked their armor. The clerk returned to them and they both laughed at whatever he said. They were still giants, even seated. Their eyes wide set, their noses long but flat, their lips curled into the permanent sneer Haille recognized from the richer, privileged classes. In addition to wealth, they had the fortune of brawn, and it gave them an added arrogance that was apparent in the way they snapped their fingers to call their squires or glared at the rumps of their female servants. Likely their father had been the one to check their ambition and even cruelty. Now with him dead, they were at liberty to explore their capacity for violence and vice, beginning with this match. No wonder they had refused to pay their workers. They were bullies, and like all bullies, they did whatever they could get away with. The clerk returned with 2 squires to his right holding 3 wooden practice swords and shields for Haille to choose from. To his left was a weak-chinned milkmaid. Refusing to meet their eyes, she held out 3 knitting needles for Red. The brothers exchanged identical guffaws across the square. Haille picked a sword of medium length.
She'll need to be able to pick from 3 swords as well,
Haille said, glaring at the needles. He felt only pity for the girl forced into her part. It doesn't matter, Red said, taking the longest of the swords. She put her hand on the girl's shoulder and lowered her eyes to meet hers. Tell your lords over there to keep their needles. They will need them to stitch up their wounds after. The girl swallowed. Haille knew she would likely say no such thing, but he was glad Red was still feeling, or at least pretending to feel, confident. He noticed that, like him, she did not take a shield. They retired to their own corner where they conferred with Julian and Stephen one last time. That's Remus and the gorget on the left, Julian said. He's likely protecting himself after I gave him a good whack to the neck last match. How did you manage that? Red asked. He holds his sword low when he's on guard, but he's likely learned from my lesson. But not his twin, Stephen said. I'd have gotten to him too if I had a longer sword. Then I have Reginald, Red said. The twins were rising off their stools and stepping into the ring, their swords and shields made from dark polished elm, held at their sides, not even a guard. It was a show of casualness that Haille would have found insulting if it did not speak of overconfidence. Good luck. We wish you the best, Julian said. Even if you are fools, Stephen added under his breath as Red and Haille walked into the square. Nice to have you behind us, Red said, shaking her sword to gauge its balance. Think of it this way. You win this bout, you will well be on the way to re-establishing your reputation as invincible, Haille said. A shadow passed over her features before she asked, Any ideas to make that happen? They live in the hinterlands. I'm counting on them not being trained. And you are? More than they are, I'm willing to bet. Even if they train, they probably fight only against one another, so they are accustomed to one opponent and only one technique, so fight them unconventionally. She smiled. The twins were approaching. Remus held his arms out to his side as if to say, Is this all? Reginald said something snide to his squires, which they obediently laughed at. There was no judge, no royal audience to bless the match. It had begun the moment they all four stepped into the ring, and now that they closed the distance, the combatants and audience grew silent. "I think all the onlookers expect a slaughter," Haille said. "Let's give them a show." Red broke into a sprint towards Remus, giving Haille pause since she had said she would take Reginald. Remus, for his part, stepped back into a fighting stance and readied his shield. Red anticipated as much by leaping up and bringing a strike downward on top of the shield, her momentum taking her into it and folding her legs beneath her. Remus gave her a shove, and like an acrobat she pivoted her weight, her free hand pushing off the face of the shield and sending her in a flying leap toward Reginald, who had already moved towards her to give his brother the advantage of numbers. Reginald was not expecting Red to turn on him so abruptly. Her swing caught him by surprise and she struck the side of his head with a crack. Blood fanned out in a spray behind his ear and his knees buckled. His sword was too low to fend off her second strike that came down on the crown of his head. Remus was already rushing Red from behind, and Haille's hesitation had put her at risk. There was little he could do to stop or even distract Remus short of throwing himself at the brute's feet to trip him. "I did say to fight unconventionally." Haille ran into the closing space between Remus and Reginald, threw himself on the ground, and rolled under Remus's shield. Remus staggered, his boot ramming Haille's ribs, but the twin tottered enough that his swing into Red went wide. He lifted the shield to smash it down on Haille, but he rolled out of the way at the last moment so that the shield's pointed end struck the earth, leaving a divot in its wake. The escapees had come alive, making such a noise that one would have been forgiven for thinking them a party 3 times the size. Haille scrambled to his feet, he and Red regrouping, back to back in the far corner. "Reginald will be woozy after those strikes," Red said. "Tire them out. That armor has to be heavy." She nodded before she darted in again at Remus while he steadied his brother. He deflected her strikes with solid blocks of his shield. Haille danced in on his opposite side and struck not his sword but his gauntlet. If Haille could get Remus to drop his sword, he knew he would have a chance to also move in close and take a shot at the twin's head. With both woozy or even one unconscious, their odds would be much better. But Remus held tight to his sword and let go of his brother to lunge at Haille. Haille spun away and felt the tip of the twin's sword graze the small of his back. That was lucky. The brothers assumed more defensive positions, their shields up over their bodies, their swords raised high, ready to strike. They had realized the cost of underestimating their opponents, and both looked ready for full combat. Red had counted on the same strategy as Haille. Without shields or armor themselves, they were quick and could dart in and out of the brothers' ranges. Haille recognized that both had long reaches, but he frustrated Remus by dodging in close, too close, for the twin to swing his sword. Haille won a point, striking Remus on the chin with his sword, but when he tried again, Remus was ready for him and met him with a punch to the gut from the pommel of his sword. Haille staggered backwards, breathless and coughing. It hurt to inhale, and stars flashed in his vision. Remus's eyes roved over him, sensing his weakness, and he stepped in to attack. Haille ducked and rolled at an oblique angle, then whipped his torso around, his sword at full extension. He meant to strike Remus's knee, but hit the greave instead. The tip of his sword splintered, but the greave's buckle gave way and it flapped forward, hobbling Remus's steps. "I'll take a punch to the gut for that." Cheers and jeers rose up from the spectators as Red continued to wear down Reginald. For every one swing he made, she countered with 3 or even 4. He was powerful but slow, and although many of her blows fell on his armor, his pride was taking a beating. His flaring temper showed it. He left himself exposed, lowering his shield as he hefted his sword blade at Red. She remained just a beat ahead of him, however, and literally danced circles around the twin as he grew tired and sweaty, his hair plastered against his forehead, his cheeks puffing. Haille knew better than to attack Remus's exposed shin right away. Instead, he made a show of engaging him in swordplay. It was not without risk. Each exchanged blow took more out of Haille than his opponent, simply due to Remus's size. The weight behind his swings was that much greater, and Haille had to strain through his counter to compensate. Haille lost ground. Remus backed him into the corner. Then Remus tried to use his strength to his advantage, preparing a crushing overhead strike for Haille. But Haille met it squarely. Remus did not relent and instead brought all his weight down on Haille's frame. Haille felt his back bend at a painful angle before he bent his knees, tilted his sword, and let Remus carry his own weight past him. The twin fell to one knee. It was a counter he had not been prepared for, one his brother would have been too large to execute, the one Haille had used successfully against larger opponents before. Remus wobbled on one knee, the other leg planted in the dirt, the greave laying open like a lolling metal tongue exposing his shin. Haille put his entire body behind the swing to Remus's shin. The sword snapped while Remus let out a deep growl from behind gritted teeth. Armed with just the handle of his sword and a stump of a blade, Haille copied Remus's own tactic and smashed the pommel of his sword into the twins' temple. Remus's body went limp, and as if lying down to sleep, he fell over on his side with a sigh and a crunch of settling metal plates. The cheers from both sides were enormous. They crashed upon Haille like waves from the sea and felt as if they had the same force. He was trembling with too many emotions to name. Guilt, relief, elation, fury, triumph, all mixed with regret and sympathy that it had come to this suffering and humiliation of another person. Then again, it was easy to sympathize with an opponent knocked cold. Haille reminded himself that moments before, that same face, slack with sleep now, had been twisted in a terrible visage, ready to destroy him and keep the escapees effectively enslaved. It was enough to spur him into action again and join the fight against Reginald. He picked up not Remus's sword, but instead his shield. It was the length of his body from knees to shoulder and felt heavy as a pregnant sow, and about as nimble. But Haille lifted it up, strapped it on his arm, turned, and ran towards Reginald with all the speed he could muster. Red upped her own attack in response, sidestepping in order to draw Reginald into a turn so that Haille crashed into his blind side. The twin lost his footing while Red locked swords, twisted her own for leverage, and forced Reginald to his knees. Then, with a second wild crash into his back with the shield, Haille knocked him down to all fours. Red's blade was waiting for his unguarded neck, the opening any executioner would dream of. But her role was not that of judge or executioner. Her sword was wood, not steel. She stayed her swing inches from his throbbing arteries and asked, "Do you yield?" At first he only panted. It was the only sound in the entire field. Blood from his ear covered the rondel at his shoulder and ran down his arm into his polished gauntlet. Haille imagined that not a single spectator was breathing. Red flicked the nape of his neck with the end of her sword and repeated her question. "Do you yield?"
Yes.
Her face split in an uncharacteristic smile, her green eyes turning to Haille, all the guardedness gone from them, wide as they were with satisfaction, triumph, and pure surprise. Haille imagined Red had never derived such satisfaction from a victory before, perhaps because this one did not require her to steel herself for a cold-blooded execution or the betrayal of children at the end. She looked over to Remus, laying prone, his squires trying to revive him, and laughed aloud, reaching out to Haille, grabbing his collar in her fist and wrapping him in an embrace. Shouts rose up from the side of the escapees. Haille thought them shouts of praise and was still locked arm in arm with Red when he realized they were warnings. But it was too late. Red's head snapped forward, her forehead striking Haille's own, and both of them tumbled. Reginald towered over them, his own practice sword cracked from the blow to Red. He had tossed the sword aside and hesitated between the two of them, Haille and Red struggling, dizzy on their hands and knees. Red was the worse for it, as she had taken the blow directly. Reginald should have attacked Haille, but his rage was directed more towards Red, a girl in his eyes, who had bested him. One gauntleted hand wrapped around her neck, trapping her hair beneath the metal fingers. The other made a steel fist and hammered her face. Her mouth exploded in red. Haille tried to stand, but only swayed sideways. Remus was getting up now, but his attention was directed elsewhere, his people screaming and pointing. So were the boys as they rushed the square while others were ducking into an unharvested field to hide. Haille heard a familiar sound, a croaking, not just from Red as she choked on her own blood, but a caw as her crow shot past, snapping wings and flashing dark feathers. With a thwack, there were more feathers, these the fletching on the end of an arrow standing out from Reginald's unguarded neck. He dropped Red, his hands closing around his own throat. Remus was calling out, giving commands, but horsemen rode into their midst, so many horsemen. Others were riding into fields with snares and nets, riding down the boys and girls who had little chance of outrunning the overseers wearing the red colors of the House of Redmont. The crow landed and hopped through the trampled earth to Red, her teeth pink with blood but her smile intact. Haille stepped towards her but stopped when 2 horsemen pulled up short. One held an emptied bow, the arrows in his quiver matching the one lodged in Reginald's neck as he lay dying. The other rider was draped in a long red cape that rested over the backside of the horse.
"Gale, you've done well," Ghost Redmond said. "The crow led us right to you."
"Your timing is opportune," Red said, getting up slowly and spitting out a red glob. Things were happening too fast for Haille to understand. He saw Julian, Stephen, even Rim ensnared and dragged to the feet of Ghost's horse. Rim's face was red and twisted. "You betrayed us!" Betrayed. Haille worked the word over in his mind. Betrayed. He looked at Red, who did not meet his own gaze. No matter, he rushed to her. "You said you were on our side!" A bright white light appeared at the corner of his vision, and geometric shapes danced in front of his eyes as the mounted overseer kicked Haille in the head. Haille was Remus now, fighting for consciousness, turned over on his side, groping at the dirt to hold himself down, for the earth was spinning too fast for him all of a sudden.
"Round them up, even the serfs of the Greystone clan. This manor and all its vassals belong to me now."
"Father, you will not forget our agreement," Red said, hunched over, head bowed, standing between her father and Haille.
"Our agreement?"
her father said, his eyebrows rising up in unison. "Our agreement," Red said, and reached into her breast pocket to draw out the folded pages bearing the likeness of Jasmine. "You said if I brought you to the camp of the lost slaves, you would give me 12 men to find the font."
"Gale, don't embarrass yourself with such foolishness,"
he said, motioning to the overseer next to him. The overseer dismounted, unlaced a club and whip from his saddle, and handed them to Red.
"I can't spare any men right now. Help me round up these slaves. We'll take them back to the estate, then we'll talk."
"You promised."
"Gale, I'm ordering you."
"I've had enough of your orders," she cried, whipped her arm around and connected the end of the club with the overseer's nose. He shouted out while mucus and blood poured over his beard. He dropped his bow. Red snatched it up, yanked the arrows from his quiver, knocked one back and let loose. It struck one of her father's own men.
"Gale!"
Ghost yelled. She ignored him and felled 2 more men, her accuracy with the bow and arrow undiminished. The men fell and their prisoners sprung up to flee.
"Gale, stop this!"
She let fly 3 more arrows in succession and dropped more of her father's men. More children rushed to escape. Haille took his opportunity, stepping around the overseer, jumping over Reginald, slipping in the twins or somebody's blood, he was not sure, and ran. He followed the others into the fields, barley and beanstalks whipping past him. The field was noisy with the clamor of children running. He came out by the camp, his chest and throat burning, his head throbbing. The boys and girls were rushing into tents, grabbing what belongings they could. Those with nothing simply fled down the rows of tents into the woods. Haille followed, hurdling tent ropes and dodging stakes. He reached a creek and splashed through. On the far side were Stephen and Rim. "Rim, you made it," he said. But his friend who had looked up to him so, who had trusted Red because he trusted Haille, made a face as if he had bitten into a rotten apple. He closed his hand into a fist and struck Haille in the neck. Everything grew dark as the boys closed on him, kicking, punching, scratching. "Traitor! You led them to us. We never should have trusted your city mouth." The blows were too many. All he could do was curl into a ball, but even then the kicks and punches continued. His body was nothing but pain. A kick to his groin made him cry out and vomit up the cider he had drunk earlier. Even then the blows did not relent. Instead they began to drag him over the ground towards the creek. "Drown him! Kill him!" He choked as his shirt was pulled up around his neck, but by now all the pain was secondary to the familiar spinning in his head, the seizing of his chest, the paralysis he felt on his face, running down his side. Time was bending again. Seconds were minutes, minutes hours. It had been an eternity since they'd fled from the fighting ring, hours that they had been dragging him. He recognized all the symptoms of a shaking fit. He heard someone cry out, "He's possessed! He's cursed! Don't touch him, you'll catch it!" Darkness overtook him. At least he would be allowed that mercy, he thought, as he would not be conscious when he died at their hands. A death he duly deserved.